The mind reader on the 742. The old man knew Daniel's name before he introduced himself, and that was only the second strangest thing that happened on the train that Tuesday morning. Daniel Mercer had been staring at the same crack in the floor of the 742 for 11 stops, which was exactly how many stops it took to ride from his apartment in Greystone to his office in Midtown, and in all 11 of those stops, he had not once looked up, not once smiled, and not once felt anything remotely resembling a reason to get off the train and go to work. He was 31 years old. He had a job that paid him well enough and meant nothing at all. He had an apartment with good light that he never noticed, a phone full of contacts he never called, and a particular kind of emptiness that didn't announce itself like sadness did. It just sat in his chest like a stone that had always been there, so long that he'd stopped noticing the weight. He was thinking for maybe the 400th time that month about quitting, not just the job, everything, logging out of the whole arrangement, selling the apartment or maybe just walking away from it, going somewhere that didn't require anything of him. He was thinking nobody would notice for at least 3 days. That was the thought in his head, not dramatically, not with self-pity, just as a flat fact he'd been turning over like a coin, when the old man sat down next to him. The seat had been empty for 6 stops. There were plenty of other empty seats, but the old man folded himself into the seat beside Daniel with the ease of someone who had been planning to sit there all along, set a canvas bag between his feet, and said without looking at him, "You should volunteer at the shelter on Clement Street." Daniel looked up. The man was maybe 70, maybe older, with a face that had accumulated its years honestly, deep lines, bright eyes the color of creek water, a gray beard trimmed close. He wore a brown corduroy jacket with the collar turned up, and he was looking straight ahead at the subway map on the opposite wall as though he had said nothing unusual at all. "Sorry," Daniel said. "The animal shelter, on Clement Street." The man turned and looked at him then, and his eyes were warm but direct, the kind of eyes that didn't perform anything. "They need volunteers on Wednesday evenings and Saturday mornings. You should go." Daniel stared at him. I don't have a dog. I've never had a dog." "I know," said the man. "Then why would I?" "Because you need somewhere to put all of that." He gestured vaguely in Daniel's direction, as though indicating a particular weather system. "And they need someone to walk the dogs. It works out." Daniel looked around the car. The other passengers were doing what subway passengers always did, staring at phones, sleeping with their necks bent at angles that would hurt later, listening to music loud enough that he could hear the thin bleed of it from their headphones. Nobody was watching this conversation. Nobody seemed to think it was strange. "Do I know you?" Daniel asked. "No," said the man. "My name is Walter." "Daniel," said Daniel automatically. "I know," Walter said again. The train slowed. Daniel looked at the station marker, 3 more stops. "How do you know my name?" Walter smiled at the subway map. It was a small smile, patient, the kind that had been in use for a long time. "You look like a Daniel," he said. "I've always been good with names." Daniel did not go to the shelter that Wednesday. He told himself he would, which was already more than he'd done with most ideas that week. He looked it up at Clement Street Animal Rescue, a nonprofit, open for volunteers Wednesday evenings 6 to 8 and Saturday mornings 9 to noon. He even pulled up the volunteer form on his phone while eating dinner alone in his apartment, fork in one hand, phone in the other, the television running in the background because silence in the apartment had started to feel like a presence rather than an absence. But he didn't fill it out. He set his phone down. He watched something he wouldn't remember the next day. He went to sleep. He thought about the old man, though. All week he thought about him. Not obsessively, not in a way he could explain, just the way you think about a song you heard somewhere and can't place, the melody appearing in the gaps between other thoughts. Because you need somewhere to put all of that. What had the man meant by that? What did he think Daniel had that needed putting somewhere? And the unsettling thing, the thing he kept returning to, was not that a stranger had spoken to him on the train. Strangers spoke to each other occasionally. It happened. The unsettling thing was that the man had said it in the tone of someone continuing a conversation rather than starting one, as though he had been listening to the thing Daniel had been thinking, and had simply decided at that moment to respond. Nobody would notice for at least 3 days. He hadn't said that aloud. He was certain he hadn't said it aloud. By Saturday morning, he was standing outside the shelter on Clement Street at 8:57, hands in his jacket pockets, telling himself he could still leave. The building was narrow and wedged between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese restaurant that wasn't open yet. There was a hand-painted sign above the door, a dog and a cat rendered in a loose, enthusiastic style by someone who loved animals more than they loved painting, and a small chalkboard sign outside that read, "Today's volunteers needed, dog walkers especially. Come in." He went in. The woman at the front desk had a name tag that said Roz, and the energy of someone who had been awake since before time was invented, and was genuinely fine with that. "Volunteer," she said before he'd spoken. "Yeah, I was thinking about it. I've never done this before." "Perfect," she said, as though his inexperience was an asset. "You ever walk a dog?" "When I was a kid, my neighbor had one." "Great, you're overqualified." She was already coming around the desk, handing him a clipboard. "Fill this out, I'll show you around. You're just in time. Saturdays we have 6 dogs right now and only 2 other volunteers coming in, so you're basically saving lives." She said this cheerfully, not dramatically, which somehow made it land differently than if she'd meant it as flattery. He filled out the form. She showed him around. The shelter smelled, predictably, of animals and industrial cleaner, and underneath both of those things, something warmer, hay, maybe, or just the accumulated presence of many creatures that were glad to be inside. There were 12 kennels. 6 were occupied. She introduced him to the dogs the way you introduce people at a party, with information she thought they'd want you to know. "This is Birch. He's a 3-year-old shepherd mix, came to us from a hoarding situation. Very sweet but gets overwhelmed by fast movement, so just keep your energy calm around him. This is Penny. She's ancient. She mostly wants to shuffle around the block and smell things. She's wonderful. This is Rocket." She paused. "Rocket will pull your arm off if you let him. Hold the leash with both hands. He's a lover, but he has absolutely no idea how large he is." Daniel looked at Rocket. Rocket was a broad-chested brown dog of indeterminate breed who was looking back at him with an expression of barely contained enthusiasm. The way a person looks when they've been waiting for a party to start, and they think it might finally be starting. "I'll take Rocket," Daniel said. Roz looked at him with new respect. "You sure?" "I like a challenge," he said, which was not something he had ever said about anything in his life, and was surprised to find he meant it. What nobody had told Daniel about walking a dog, and this seemed like important information that should be more widely distributed, was that it was, structurally, a solution to almost every social problem he had. Rocket made it impossible to look at his phone. Rocket required his full attention, both hands on the leash, eyes on the sidewalk, constant subtle adjustments of direction and speed. Rocket was not interested in Daniel's problems or his thoughts about quitting or his stone-in-the-chest feeling. Rocket was interested in pigeons and in a specific fire hydrant 3 blocks east, and in whether the man sitting outside the coffee shop might possibly have food, and in Daniel, actually, in Daniel quite a lot, checking back over his shoulder every 20 seconds with an expression that said, "Still there. Good. Good that you're there." And the other thing, the thing he really hadn't anticipated, was that people talked to you. When you walked a dog, strangers stopped and asked about the dog, and you told them the dog's name, and they bent down and let the dog smell their hand. And sometimes the dog licked their face and they laughed. and something passed between you and the stranger that was easy and uncomplicated, and asked nothing of either of you except for this moment, this dog, this Saturday morning. A little girl in a yellow coat asked if she could pet Rocket. Her mother stood behind her, hand on her shoulder. Daniel said yes and crouched down and showed the little girl how to let Rocket smell her first, and Rocket was gentle in the way large dogs, sometimes surprisingly, are careful, aware of his own size, and the little girl looked up at Daniel with enormous eyes and said, "Does he have a home?" And Daniel said, "Not yet, but he will." And the little girl said very seriously, "I hope it's a good one." And her mother caught Daniel's eye over the little girl's head, and they exchanged a smile that was entirely human and cost nothing. He walked Rocket for 40 minutes. Then he walked Penny for 30 minutes, which was less walking and more a meditative processional. Penny stopping every 15 feet to smell the base of a tree or stare at something invisible in the middle distance, with the philosophical attention of someone reading a very long novel. He went back every Wednesday after that, and every Saturday. The third Wednesday, Roz asked him if he'd ever considered fostering. "I live in an apartment," he said. "Lots of our fosters live in apartments. It's fine for smaller dogs, and sometimes for larger ones depending on how much you exercise them." She paused. "You exercise them a lot." "I've been walking more," he said, which was true. He'd been walking more generally. He didn't know exactly when it had started, but some mornings he got off the train 2 stops early and walked the rest of the way, not for any fitness reason, just because the walking felt better than standing still. "Think about it," Roz said. He thought about it. He said yes 2 weeks later. Her name was Marigold. She was a small terrier mix, 4 years old, with one ear that stood up and one ear that folded over at the tip, and a personality that Roz described as opinionated, and that Daniel quickly understood to mean she knew exactly what she wanted at every moment and communicated it without apology. She wanted to sleep at the foot of his bed. She wanted her breakfast at 7. She wanted to go to the park, not the other park, this park, the one with the big oak tree, and she wanted to sniff the entire perimeter before she would commit to doing anything else. The apartment, which had been too quiet, was no longer too quiet. The apartment, which had felt like a space he occupied rather than a place he lived, began, gradually, almost without his noticing, to feel like a place he lived. He started cooking dinner instead of ordering it, because Marigold sat in the kitchen while he cooked and watched him with focused approval, and cooking for himself while a dog watched felt like a reasonable thing to do in a way that cooking for himself while a television watched had not. He started going to bed at a regular time because Marigold expected it. He started waking up with something to do, which was small but turned out to matter more than almost any productivity advice he'd ever read. He called his sister in November for the first time in 4 months. She asked what he'd been up to, and he said he was fostering a dog named Marigold and walking shelter dogs on weekends, and his sister said, "Danny, that's weight, really." And he could hear in her voice that she was relieved about something, though she didn't say what, and he thought he understood what it was. He ran into Walter in December. He'd been thinking he might have imagined him, or at least that he'd imagined the strangeness of it, that the conversation had probably been perfectly ordinary, and his mind had just been in such a strange state that morning that he'd read too much into it. A man on a train had mentioned a shelter. People mentioned things. It had just been coincidence or kindness, or Walter having a niece who worked there, or any one of 100 explanations that required no mystery. But Walter was standing outside the shelter on a Saturday morning when Daniel arrived, wearing the same corduroy jacket with the collar turned up, holding a small paper bag that turned out to contain dog treats. "They prefer the salmon ones," Walter said, by way of greeting, holding the bag out. "The beef ones are fine, but Birch specifically prefers salmon." "Walter," Daniel said. "Daniel," he smiled, "how's Marigold?" Daniel stopped. "How do you?" "Roz mentioned her," Walter said, nodding toward the door. I volunteer here too, just not on the days you're usually here. He held the door open. Come on, Birch will be waiting for you. They walked dogs together that morning. Birch and Penny, because Rocket had been adopted 3 weeks earlier by a family in the Richmond district. A development that Daniel had been happier about than he'd expected to be, and sadder about. And then happier about again, which was apparently how it worked. Walter walked with the unhurried quality of a man who had stopped fighting whatever pace life was setting, and found it to be a perfectly good pace. Can I ask you something? Daniel said after they'd been walking for a while. You want to know how I knew? Walter said. Yeah. Walter considered this. They walked half a block before he answered. My wife died 4 years ago, he said. We were married 42 years. After she died, I used to sit on the train and look at people and think about how many of them were carrying something they hadn't told anyone about. He paused. Not because I'm psychic, just because I was carrying something too, and you start to recognize it. The way a person holds their shoulders, the particular way someone looks at the floor. He glanced at Daniel. You had a look. What look? Like someone who had stopped believing they took up enough space to be worth noticing. He said it without cruelty, just as an observation, the way you might describe a weather pattern. I've seen it before. I had it myself for a while after Margaret died. Daniel didn't say anything. The morning was cold and clear, and Birch was walking with dignified calm between them. And the shelter? Daniel finally asked. When Margaret was sick, someone brought a therapy dog to the hospital. She lit up like you wouldn't believe. 42 years I knew her face, and that dog found something in it I'd never quite seen. He smiled at the memory. After she passed, I started volunteering here. I don't have a scientific explanation for why it helped. I just know it did. Something about being needed in a way that's uncomplicated. They don't need you to be interesting or successful or to have your life figured out. They just need you to show up, and they'll do the rest. They walked another block. You said you knew my name, Daniel said. Walter laughed, a real laugh, warm and unhurried. I guessed. You looked like a Daniel. I've always said that, and I'm right more often than I should be. He shrugged. You filled in the rest yourself. Marigold was adopted in January by a schoolteacher named Caroline, who came into the shelter on a Saturday morning and sat on the floor of the meet and greet room and let Marigold climb into her lap and make her decision, which she made in approximately 45 seconds. Daniel signed the paperwork with a hand that was only slightly unsteady, and Caroline said, I'll send you pictures. And he said, You don't have to. And she said, I want to. And she did. The first one arrived the following Thursday, Marigold asleep in a sunbeam on a blue couch, one ear up and one ear folded over, looking entirely at home in a new place. He fostered a beagle named Copernicus after that. Then an elderly lab named Susan. Then 2 kittens who had arrived together and needed to be kept together, and whose names he was told were Biscuit and Gravy, which he felt were undignified names, but they didn't seem to mind. He did not quit his job in winter or spring. In spring, though, he had lunch with a colleague he'd been vaguely friendly with for years and had never actually spent time with, and she mentioned she was looking to start a nonprofit focused on workforce development, and she needed someone who was good with numbers and didn't need things to be glamorous. He told her he'd think about it. He thought about it for 2 weeks. He said yes. He didn't quit his job immediately. He stayed through the transition, finished what he'd started, handed things off carefully. That felt important, finishing things carefully. It was new. The last time he saw Walter on the train, it was April. The 7:42, a Tuesday, going into the city. Walter was already seated when Daniel got on, reading a paperback novel with a broken spine. Daniel sat down next to him. How's the book? Daniel asked. Terrible, Walter said pleasantly. Can't put it down. He looked over at Daniel. You look different. Do I? Yes. He studied him for a moment with those creek-water eyes. You take up more space. Daniel thought about this. Outside the window, the city was doing what it did in April, hesitantly beautiful, uncertain of its own warmth, full of people who seemed surprised to find themselves wanting things again. "I have 3 foster kittens right now," Daniel said, "and I'm starting a new job in June." "How are the kittens?" "Chaotic. They knocked my lamp off the table last night. Both of them looked directly at me while it was happening, and neither of them looked sorry." Walter laughed. "That's cats." "Yeah," Daniel smiled. "It's good, though, having things that need you." "It is," Walter said. "That's the whole secret, I think. Not happiness, not success, just being needed in ways that are real." He turned back to his terrible book. "The rest has a way of working itself out." 3 stops later, Walter folded the corner of his page, stood up, and got off the train. He didn't say goodbye exactly. He touched Daniel's shoulder briefly as he passed, the way you do with someone you expect to see again, which meant it wasn't really goodbye at all. Daniel rode the rest of the way to his stop. He got off 2 stops early. He walked. The city was loud and indifferent and enormous, the way cities are, full of people on trains looking at floors and thinking things they hadn't told anyone. He walked through it with his shoulders back, and the particular kind of unhurried attention that he'd learned from an elderly dog named Penny, and a man in a corduroy jacket on a Tuesday morning. He was needed at the shelter on Saturday. He was needed at home by 2 kittens who had no remorse. He was needed at a new job in June by people trying to build something real. He had a sister he called on Thursdays now. He realized, an actual life, not the life he'd been waiting to start, or the life he'd assumed would arrive once he'd figured something out. Just this one. Just the one that had been available all along, the one that turned out to require nothing more dramatic than showing up to walk a dog, and then showing up again the following Wednesday, and then the Saturday after that. The crack in the floor of the 742 was still there. He hadn't looked at it in months,